The Krex warrior Thaklor had faced death many times. He had survived 3 planetary invasions, countless space battles, and had once killed a void leviathan with nothing but his claws and pure determination. But as he lay bleeding in the twisted wreckage of his scout ship, watching his blue blood pool on the alien grass beneath him, he knew this might be his final moment. The crash had been catastrophic. His ship, a sleek hunter-class vessel designed for reconnaissance missions, had been caught in an unexpected gravitational anomaly while scouting this primitive world. The navigation systems had failed, the engines had overloaded, and he'd barely managed to engage emergency protocols before impact. Now, 3 of his 4 arms were broken, his exoskeleton was cracked in several places, and his left leg was pinned beneath a piece of burning debris. Thaklor tried to focus through the pain. His people, the Krex, were known throughout the galaxy as apex predators. Standing 8 feet tall with 4 powerful arms, razor-sharp retractable claws, and thick armored skin that could deflect most energy weapons, they had conquered 17 star systems through pure physical dominance. Pain was simply something to be endured, weakness was death, and showing vulnerability was the fastest way to lose status in their rigid hierarchy. But this pain was different. It wasn't the clean pain of battle or the satisfying burn of muscles pushed to their limit. This was the deep, grinding agony of serious injury, the kind that spoke of internal bleeding and organ damage. His vision kept blurring, and he could taste the metallic tang of his own blood in his mouth. The world around him was surprisingly beautiful for what his databases had classified as a death world. The gravity here was nearly twice what most civilized species considered comfortable, yet somehow life flourished. Tall green plants swayed in a breeze that carried the scent of unknown flowers. In the distance, he could see a vast body of water that sparkled under the light of this system's yellow star. The sky was an unusual shade of blue, with white formations that he supposed must be water vapor suspended in the atmosphere. It was peaceful, which made it all the more ironic that he would probably die here. Thaklor had been part of an advance scouting mission for the Krex Empire's expansion into this sector. Intelligence reports had indicated that the 3rd planet of this system harbored primitive life, possibly even sentient beings, but nothing that could pose a threat to Krex superiority. The plan had been simple: survey the world, catalog any useful resources, and report back on the feasibility of colonization or strip mining operations. He had not expected the gravitational anomalies that seemed to riddle this star system, nor had he expected his ship's sophisticated instruments to be confused by what appeared to be some kind of magnetic interference. The primitive inhabitants hadn't even seemed to notice his ship's presence, which suggested their technology was even more rudimentary than anticipated. A sound made him turn his massive head, ignoring the spike of pain that shot down his spine. Something was moving through the tall grass toward his crash site. His hand instinctively moved toward his plasma rifle, only to discover that his weapon had been thrown clear of the wreckage and now lay 20 meters away, far beyond his reach in his current condition. Thaklor's enhanced hearing picked up the sound more clearly now. Footsteps, but not the heavy, purposeful stride of a predator or the careful, fearful steps of prey. These footsteps had a strange rhythm, almost musical in their casualness. Whatever was approaching wasn't afraid, which immediately put him on alert. On a death world like this, anything that wasn't afraid was probably something that shouldn't be underestimated. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. It was rhythmic and melodic, rising and falling in pleasant patterns. His universal translator, built into his combat suit, was picking up linguistic patterns but seemed to be having trouble processing them. Strange. Then he saw her. She was small, impossibly small. If she was indeed representative of this planet's dominant species, then the intelligence reports had been more wrong than he'd thought possible. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall and was built with a delicacy that seemed almost fragile. Her skin was smooth and pale, completely unarmored, and Her body showed none of the obvious adaptations he would expect from a death world inhabitant. No claws, no fangs, no armor plating, no redundant limbs. Her head was covered with long, flowing strands of some kind of fiber that moved in the breeze, colored a warm brown with hints of gold where the sunlight hit it. Her eyes were large and bright, a startling shade of green that seemed to reflect the light with unusual intensity. She wore some kind of simple covering over her body, colored blue and white, that appeared to serve no protective function whatsoever. But what struck him most was her expression. She wasn't afraid. She should have been terrified. Here was a massive alien warrior, 8 feet of predatory power and obvious lethality, bleeding and dangerous in the wreckage of advanced technology that should have been beyond her comprehension. Any reasonable creature would have fled or at least shown some sign of caution. Instead, she looked concerned. She approached with those same musical footsteps, and Thacklor realized that the sound he'd been hearing was coming from her. She was making those rhythmic, melodic sounds with her mouth, apparently unconsciously. His translator, finally, managed to process some of the linguistic patterns, identifying them as a form of vocal expression that seemed to serve no communication purpose. The closest translation his systems could provide was something like sound pattern for pleasure or emotional regulation. She stopped about 10 feet away and looked at the wreckage with those impossibly expressive eyes. Her gaze traveled over the twisted metal and sparking electronics, then settled on him. He saw her focus on his injuries, on the blue blood staining his armor, and the debris pinning his leg. "Ouch! Careful, you silly creature," she said, and his translator rendered her words in standard Galactic. "Your paws look hurt." Paws. Thacklor looked down at his 4 powerful arms, each ending in hands equipped with retractable claws that could tear through battle armor. She thought they were paws. She thought he was some kind of animal. Before he could process this insult properly, she was moving again, approaching with that same casual fearlessness. Every instinct he had was screaming warnings. This was a death world. Nothing here should be this calm around a predator like him. His people had learned to trust their instincts because those instincts had kept them alive long enough to conquer half the galaxy. But she wasn't displaying any predatory behavior. If anything, her body language reminded him of the healer caste back home, the specialized Krex who tended to injuries and managed medical facilities. There was something in the way she moved, a purposeful but non-threatening approach that seemed designed to minimize alarm. She stopped just out of reach and crouched down, bringing her face closer to his level. This close, he could see details that made even less sense. Her skin was completely unmarked by scars, suggesting she had never been in serious combat. Her hands were small and delicate, with no visible weapons or natural defenses. Her eyes held an intelligence that was immediately recognizable, but it was combined with something else, something his translator was struggling to categorize. "You're really hurt, aren't you, big guy?" she said softly. "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to help." Help? The concept was so foreign in this context that Thacklor almost didn't understand what she meant. Help was something that happened within established pack hierarchies or alliance structures. Help was something you earned through strength or traded for resources. Help wasn't something a tiny, defenseless creature offered to a massive predator from another world. She was looking at his trapped leg now, her expression focused and analytical. He could practically see her mind working as she examined the situation. The piece of debris pinning him was a section of his ship's hull plating, made from Krex military-grade composites designed to withstand plasma fire and physical impacts that would vaporize most materials. It probably weighed more than her entire body several times over. "Okay," she said, apparently talking to herself as much as to him. "That's definitely too heavy for me to lift by myself, but I bet I can figure something out." She stood up and began walking around the wreckage, examining it from different angles. Thacklor watched in fascination as she picked up pieces of debris, testing their weight and strength. She was investigating his technology with the same casual confidence she had shown in approaching him apparently unconcerned that she was handling materials and systems that were centuries beyond her civilization's capabilities. More concerning was the fact that she seemed to understand what she was looking at. She avoided the still-sparking power conduits without being told they were dangerous. She didn't try to touch the glowing sections of the hull where the metal was still cooling from the heat of atmospheric entry. And when she found a piece of structural beam that was roughly the right size and shape, she nodded with satisfaction as if she'd been looking for exactly that. "This should work as a lever," she announced, apparently addressing him directly now. "The trick is finding the right fulcrum point and making sure I don't accidentally make things worse." Lever. Fulcrum. She was casually discussing principles of physics and mechanical engineering while standing in the wreckage of technology that should have been completely beyond her understanding. Thacklor's mental image of primitive Death World inhabitants was rapidly crumbling. She found a smaller piece of debris to use as a fulcrum and positioned it carefully near the edge of the hull plating. Then she slid the beam into place and tested the leverage. The massive piece of metal actually moved slightly, lifting just enough to prove that her plan was workable. "Okay, this is going to work," she said, looking back at him with a reassuring expression. "But I need you to help me. When I push down on this lever, the metal should lift enough for you to pull your leg free." "Can you do that?" Could he do that? Thacklor was a Krex warrior. He had trained since childhood in techniques of combat and survival. He had lifted weights that would crush most species and had endured pain that would drive lesser beings insane. Of course, he could pull his leg free once the weight was lifted. But that wasn't what surprised him about her question. What surprised him was that she had asked. She hadn't simply assumed he would cooperate, or demanded his compliance, or threatened consequences if he didn't follow her plan. She had asked for his participation as if they were partners in this endeavor. "I can do that," he managed to say, his voice coming out as a growling rumble that made her universal translator work overtime. She smiled at him, and Thacklor felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. That smile held warmth and encouragement and something else he couldn't quite identify. Among the Krex, emotional displays were either signs of weakness or calculated intimidation tactics. But this expression seemed to be purely for his benefit, meant to reassure and comfort him. "Good. On 3, okay? 1, 2, 3. She threw her weight against the lever, and Thacklor was amazed to see the massive piece of hull plating actually lift. The gap was small, only a few inches, but it was enough. He pulled his leg free with a motion that sent new spikes of pain through his body, but also brought a relief so intense it was almost euphoric. The moment his leg was clear, she released the lever, and the metal crashed back down with a sound like thunder. She was breathing hard from the effort, but her face showed satisfaction and relief. "There we go," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Now let's see what else needs fixing." "What else needs fixing?" As if freeing him from the wreckage was just the first item on a list of tasks she intended to complete. Thacklor stared at her as she knelt down beside him and began examining his injuries with the focused attention of a trained medic. "These look pretty serious," she said, gently probing the cracks in his exoskeleton with fingertips that were surprisingly warm. "I don't think anything is broken all the way through, but you're definitely going to need some help healing. And this bleeding needs to stop." She stood up and looked around, apparently searching for something specific. Her gaze settled on a section of his ship where part of the medical bay was still intact. "Is that some kind of first aid equipment?" she asked, pointing toward the medical bay. Thacklor nodded, not trusting his voice. She had identified the medical bay from among all the wreckage, apparently recognizing its function despite never having seen Krex technology before. Either she was incredibly intuitive, or the inhabitants of this world were far more advanced than anyone had realized. She made her way to the medical bay and began examining the equipment inside. Most of it was damaged, but the basic medical supplies were stored in reinforced containers designed to survive crashes exactly like this one. She found the emergency medical kit and brought it back to where he lay. "I don't know how your biology works," she said, opening the kit, and examining the contents. But some things are probably universal. Bleeding is bad, broken bones need to be stabilized, and wounds need to be kept clean. She was right, of course. Those were universal principles of emergency medicine. But how did she know that? How did this small, apparently primitive creature possess knowledge of medical care that translated across species barriers? She found the correct equivalent of bandages and antiseptic, apparently recognizing their function by context and packaging. With movements that were both gentle and efficient, she began cleaning his wounds and applying the bandages. Her touch was careful and precise, minimizing his pain while ensuring that the treatments were effective. "There," she said when she was finished. "That should help with the bleeding. The rest is going to take time and rest." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with those expressive green eyes. "You're from somewhere else, aren't you? I mean, not just from another country or something. You're from really far away." Taklor nodded slowly. There seemed no point in deception, especially after what she had just done for him. "I thought so," she said with satisfaction. "The technology is way too advanced, and you don't look like anything that evolved here. Plus, the way you crashed suggests you came from space." "From space." She said it as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. No fear, no awe, no religious significance attributed to his alien nature. Just matter-of-fact acceptance that beings from other worlds might occasionally crash land in her vicinity. "Are there others like you coming?" she asked. And for the first time since he'd met her, Thaklor heard something that might have been concern in her voice. The question was more complex than she probably realized. Yes, there were others coming. The Krex fleet was probably already looking for him, and when they failed to find him, they would send larger search parties. Eventually, they would find this world and evaluate it for conquest or resource extraction. The small, defenseless inhabitants would be classified as either useful slaves or irrelevant obstacles to be removed. But looking at this creature who had risked herself to help him, who had shown him kindness without expectation of reward, who had treated his injuries with gentle hands and spoken to him with warmth and compassion, Thaklor found himself reluctant to tell her the truth. "Yes," he said finally, "others will come looking for me." She nodded thoughtfully. "Will they be friendly like you? Friendly like him?" Thaklor almost laughed at the description. He was a Krex warrior bred and trained for conquest and violence. He had killed more sentient beings than this creature had probably ever seen. He was covered in scars from 1,000 battles and equipped with weapons designed to cause maximum destruction. But then he remembered how she had approached him without fear, how she had worked to free him from the wreckage, how she had tended to his wounds with gentle care. From her perspective, perhaps he did seem friendly. Perhaps, in this strange circumstance, he was being friendly. "I don't know," he said, and realized it was the first completely honest thing he had said since meeting her. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking. There was an intelligence in her eyes that was both sharp and warm, analytical, but not cold. Finally, she smiled at him again. "Well," she said, "I guess we'll figure that out when they get here. In the meantime, you need to heal, and I need to get you somewhere more comfortable than lying in a pile of crashed spaceship." She stood up and looked around, apparently evaluating the surrounding area for suitable shelter. In the distance, Thaklor could see what appeared to be structures of some kind, probably the settlement where she lived. The idea of being taken to her community should have triggered every tactical instinct he possessed. Unknown territory, potential hostiles, no backup or weapons. Instead, for the first time since his crash, he felt something that might have been hope. "My name is Sarah, by the way," she said, looking back down at him with that warm expression. "What should I call you?" "Thaklor," he replied, and watched her repeat the name silently, apparently practicing the pronunciation. "Thaklor," she said aloud, and smiled when she got it right. "Nice to meet you, Thaklor. Now let's get you somewhere safe." As she began planning how to move him without aggravating his injuries, Thaklor found himself staring up at the alien sky and wondering if everything he had believed about strength and survival and the nature of the galaxy might be fundamentally wrong, because this small, seemingly defenseless creature had just demonstrated a kind of power he had never encountered before. The power to care for others without asking for anything in return. Moving an 8-foot-tall, four-armed alien warrior with multiple injuries across rough terrain should have been impossible for someone of Sarah's size and apparent physical limitations. Thacklor had initially assumed that she would need to bring others from her settlement, which had worried him considerably. The more of these creatures who knew about his presence, the more complex the situation would become when the Krek's fleet arrived. But Sarah had surprised him again. She had disappeared for what felt like hours, leaving him with strict instructions to remain still and avoid aggravating his injuries. The waiting had been difficult, not just because of the pain, but because it gave him time to think about the implications of what was happening. Everything about this encounter contradicted his understanding of how first contact situations were supposed to proceed. When she returned, she was pulling behind her a device that his combat-trained mind immediately recognized as a transport platform, though it was unlike any technology he had seen before. It was clearly handmade, constructed from what appeared to be organic materials and simple mechanical components. The platform itself was a flat wooden surface mounted on multiple wheels, with adjustable supports that could be raised or lowered. "I built this to help move heavy equipment around the farm," she explained, positioning the platform beside him with practiced efficiency. "It should work just fine for getting you to the house." Farm? Thacklor processed this information while watching her adjust the platform's height to match the ground where he lay. Agriculture was typically a sign of advanced civilization, requiring long-term planning, surplus production, and complex social organization. Yet her equipment appeared to be remarkably simple and efficient rather than primitive. Getting him onto the platform required careful coordination. Sarah proved to be stronger than her appearance suggested, though still nowhere near powerful enough to lift his body weight directly. Instead, she had developed a system of leverage and gradual movement that allowed her to help him transfer his weight without causing additional injury. "Easy does it," she said, supporting his upper torso as he maneuvered himself onto the platform. "We're not in any hurry. Better to take our time and do it right than to rush and make things worse." Her patience was remarkable. Among the Kreks, efficiency and speed were valued above almost everything else. Wounded warriors were expected to recover quickly or be replaced by those who could. The idea of taking time simply to minimize discomfort was alien to his experience, yet he found it unexpectedly comforting. Once he was settled on the platform, she covered him with a large piece of fabric that appeared to be woven from plant fibers. The material was soft and warm, and he realized it was meant to protect him from the elements during transport. "The house is about half a mile through the woods," she said, beginning to pull the platform with a rope harness she had rigged around her shoulders. "It's not a difficult path, but there are a few bumpy spots. Let me know if you need me to stop." The journey gave Thacklor his first real look at this world beyond the crash site. The forest they traveled through was dense and incredibly diverse, with plant life that seemed almost impossibly lush and varied. His enhanced senses picked up hundreds of different scents, many indicating the presence of animal life. Yet nothing they encountered showed any fear of Sarah's presence. Birds with brightly colored feathers called to each other from the trees above, apparently unbothered by the sight of an alien being transported through their territory. Small mammals watched curiously from the underbrush, but made no attempt to flee or attack. Most remarkably, several times Sarah paused to speak to various creatures they encountered, addressing them as if they were old friends. "Morning, Chester," she said to a large furry animal that emerged from the trees to investigate their passage. "This is Thacklor. He's had an accident, so we're being extra careful today." The creature, which Thacklor's knowledge base identified as some kind of predatory mammal, approached without any sign of aggression and actually allowed Sarah to scratch behind its ears. It studied Thacklor with intelligent eyes, but seemed to accept Sarah's explanation that he was not a threat. "Chester's been living in these woods for about 3 years," Sarah explained as they continued along the path. "He showed up one winter with an injured paw, and I helped him heal. He never went back to wherever he came from. So now he's basically the neighborhood watch system. Neighborhood watch system. She was describing a wild predator as if it were a security guard. Thacklor began to suspect that Sarah's relationship with her environment was far more complex than he had initially realized. The path wound through areas that showed clear signs of careful management. Trees have been selectively harvested to create clearings where sunlight could reach the forest floor, encouraging the growth of different plant species. Water channels have been subtly redirected to prevent erosion while maintaining natural flow patterns. It was environmental engineering of a sophistication that suggested deep understanding of ecological systems. "You did all this?" Thacklor asked, gesturing at the managed landscape around them. "Well, not all by myself," Sarah replied, pausing to adjust her grip on the rope. "The land tells you what it needs if you know how to listen. I just help it along sometimes." The land tells you what it needs. Thacklor had heard similar concepts from some of the more philosophical species in the galaxy, but those were usually highly advanced civilizations with centuries of ecological science behind them. The idea that this apparently primitive world had developed such sophisticated understanding was fascinating and concerning in equal measure. They emerged from the forest into a clearing that took Thacklor's breath away. Sarah's home was integrated into the landscape so seamlessly that it took him a moment to identify where natural features ended and construction began. The building appeared to be grown rather than built, with living trees forming structural elements and walls that seemed to be a hybrid of organic and constructed materials. Gardens surrounded the house in carefully planned arrangements that provided both food and beauty. Thacklor could identify dozens of different plant species, many of which were clearly cultivated for specific purposes. Food plants were mixed with others that he guessed might be medicinal or industrial in nature. The entire setup demonstrated a level of agricultural sophistication that should have required large-scale mechanization and advanced chemistry. "Welcome home," Sarah said, pulling the platform up to what appeared to be the main entrance. "Let's get you inside and properly settled." The interior of the house was even more remarkable than the exterior. The rooms were spacious and filled with natural light from windows that had been cleverly positioned to maximize illumination while minimizing heat loss. The furniture appeared to be handcrafted but was both beautiful and functional, showing an aesthetic sensibility that Thacklor found surprisingly appealing. What struck him most was the technology. While everything appeared to be organic and handmade, closer examination revealed systems of considerable sophistication. Water flowed through pipes that appeared to be hollowed-out plant material, but showed signs of careful engineering. Light sources were some kind of bioluminescent organism that had been cultivated to provide steady, controllable illumination. Temperature control seemed to be managed through a combination of architecture and what might have been selective breeding of heat-producing plants. Sarah helped him transfer from the transport platform to a large, comfortable surface that seemed designed specifically for resting and recovery. The material was soft but supportive, and he realized it was probably some kind of living mattress that adjusted to his body weight and distribution. "This is the guest room," she explained, adjusting pillows to support his injured areas. "I don't get visitors very often, but I try to keep it ready just in case." Guest room. The concept implied a social structure sophisticated enough to have formal hospitality customs. Yet there was something about the way she said it that suggested visitors were indeed rare, which raised questions about the nature of her community. "Are there others nearby?" Thacklor asked, trying to understand the social context of his situation. "Oh yes," Sarah said, checking his bandages and adjusting his position to ensure he was comfortable. "The nearest neighbors are about 5 miles east, and there's a proper town about 20 miles south. But we all tend to give each other plenty of space. Privacy is important when you're doing work that requires concentration." Work that requires concentration. Another intriguing hint about the nature of her activities. Thacklor was beginning to form a picture of a civilization that was far more advanced than it appeared on the surface, possibly deliberately concealing its true capabilities. Sarah left him to rest while she prepared what she called proper medical supplies. The guest room gave him an opportunity to observe his surroundings more carefully and try to make sense of what he was experiencing. The walls were covered with what appeared to be books, though many were clearly handwritten rather than mechanically produced. The subjects, based on the titles he could read, ranged from practical topics like agriculture and engineering to more abstract fields like mathematics and philosophy. Several appeared to deal with subjects that his database didn't recognize at all. There were also images displayed throughout the room, some that appeared to be artistic representations of landscapes, and others that looked more technical in nature. One series showed detailed anatomical drawings of various creatures, including several species that looked familiar from Crek's databases of galactic fauna. How did an inhabitant of this supposedly primitive world have access to accurate representations of alien life forms? Sarah returned, carrying a collection of supplies that made Thaklor reassess his assumptions about her medical knowledge yet again. Along with more conventional items like bandages and antiseptics, she had brought several containers of substances that his enhanced senses identified as complex chemical compounds. Some appeared to be naturally derived, but others showed signs of sophisticated processing or synthesis. "I've been thinking about your biology," she said, sitting down beside him with a focused expression. "Your blood chemistry suggests a metabolism that's more efficient than most Earth creatures, but also potentially more sensitive to certain environmental factors. These should help with healing without interfering with your natural processes." She had analyzed his blood chemistry. Based on what evidence? Thaklor realized that while he had been unconscious after the crash, she must have conducted some kind of medical examination sophisticated enough to determine the basic parameters of his alien physiology. "How did you?" he began, but she was already applying one of her compounds to his injuries, and the immediate relief from pain was so significant that he lost track of his question. "Better?" she asked, noting his reaction. "Much better," he admitted. The substance seemed to be accelerating his natural healing processes while simultaneously reducing inflammation and pain. It was exactly the kind of treatment he might have expected from a Crek's military medical facility, but certainly not from a primitive death world inhabitant. "Good. The next few days are going to be crucial for your recovery. The important thing is to let your body do what it knows how to do while we make sure you have everything you need." She stood up and looked out the window toward the forest. "Now, about those friends of yours who might be coming to look for you. What should I expect?" The question he had been dreading. Thaklor looked at this remarkable creature who had shown him such kindness and care and tried to figure out how to explain that his people were conquerors who would view her world as either a resource to be exploited or an obstacle to be eliminated. "They are not like me," he said carefully. "How so?" "They will not understand what you have done for me. Among my people, kindness to strangers is not common." Sarah turned back to face him, and he could see her processing this information. There was no fear in her expression, but there was a thoughtfulness that suggested she understood the implications. "I see," she said simply. "And if they find you here, with me taking care of you, they might interpret that as some kind of threat or weakness." Her understanding was uncomfortably accurate. Among the Kreks, accepting help from a member of an inferior species would indeed be seen as a sign of weakness. Worse, it might be interpreted as collaboration with potential enemies or, at best, a complete failure of warrior judgment. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to be smart about how we handle that situation when it comes up." When it comes up, not if. She was already accepting that contact with his people was inevitable and beginning to plan for how to manage it. Her calm, practical approach to what was potentially an existential threat for her entire world was both admirable and deeply concerning. "Sarah," he said, using her name for the first time, "you don't understand what my people are capable of. When they come, they will see your world as a resource to be claimed. Your people, you will be seen as obstacles." She sat down again and looked at him with those expressive green eyes. "And will you see us as, Thaklor?" The question hit him like a physical blow. What did he see her as? When he had first arrived in this system, he would have classified her and her kind as primitive beings, possibly useful as labor, but more likely irrelevant to Krek's interests. Now, after experiencing her kindness, her intelligence, her remarkable capabilities, and the sophistication of her civilization, he found his perspective completely altered. "I don't know," he said, and again realized it was the truth. "Well," Sarah said with a smile that somehow managed to be both gentle and determined, "we have some time to figure it out. Your friends probably won't arrive for at least a few days, right? That gives us a chance to get you healthy and maybe understand each other a bit better." She stood up again and headed toward what he assumed was a food preparation area. "Are you hungry? I imagine healing takes a lot of energy, and I bet it's been a while since you've had a proper meal." Thaklor realized that he was indeed hungry, though he hadn't been paying attention to such basic needs in the stress of his situation. More importantly, he found himself curious about what kind of food this remarkable world might produce. "Yes," he said, "I would appreciate that." "Great. I'll put together something nourishing but easy to digest. And while I'm cooking, why don't you tell me about where you come from? I'd love to learn about other worlds." As Sarah moved around her kitchen with the same efficient competence she had shown in everything else, Thaklor found himself facing a choice that would have been unthinkable just a few hours earlier. He could maintain operational security, reveal nothing about Krek civilization and military capabilities, and preserve whatever tactical advantages people might have when they arrived. Or he could tell this extraordinary creature the truth about the galaxy she was about to become part of, and trust that her remarkable intelligence and compassion might somehow find a solution that his warriors' training insisted was impossible. The smell of cooking food filled the air, rich and complex and unlike anything in his experience. Outside the window, he could see the managed forest and gardens that spoke of a civilization both more primitive and more sophisticated than anything in the Krek's databases. And in the kitchen, a small human woman hummed one of those musical patterns while preparing a meal for an alien warrior who should have been her enemy, treating him with the same casual kindness she might show to any injured creature she had found in the woods. For the first time in his military career, Thaklor decided that the truth might be worth the risk. The meal Sarah prepared challenged every assumption Thaklor had ever held about primitive civilizations. What she placed before him was not just food, but a carefully balanced nutritional composition that seemed designed specifically for his alien physiology. Somehow, without access to advanced medical scanners or databases of Krek's dietary requirements, she had created something that was both delicious and perfectly suited to his healing needs. "The protein comes from a legume that I've been developing," she explained, settling down across from him with her own plate. "It's bioengineered to be complete in all essential amino acids, and I've bred it to be easily digestible for a wide range of metabolisms. The carbohydrates are slow release for sustained energy, and the trace minerals should help with cellular repair." Bioengineered. The word stopped Thaklor mid-bite. "You engineered this yourself?" "Oh yes," Sarah said casually, as if genetic manipulation were a common hobby. "It's taken about 15 years to get it right, but I think I've finally achieved the optimal balance. I started with base genetics from several different plants and slowly bred in the characteristics I wanted. 15 years of selective breeding to create a perfect nutritional source. On most worlds, that kind of agricultural development required teams of scientists, industrial laboratories, and considerable financial investment. Yet Sarah spoke of it as a personal project she had pursued in her spare time. "Sarah," Thaklor said carefully, "what exactly do you do for a living?" She paused with her fork halfway to her mouth and gave him a look that might have been amused. "I suppose you could say I'm a researcher. I study living systems and try to understand how they could be optimized for health and sustainability." "What kind of living systems?" "All kinds. Plants, animals, ecosystems, social structures, individual organisms." She gestured toward the window, where the managed forest was visible in the afternoon light. "Everything is connected, you know. You can't really understand any one part without understanding how it fits into the whole. Thacklor was beginning to suspect that Sarah was far more than she appeared. But before he could pursue that line of questioning further, she turned the conversation in a direction that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Now," she said with that same gentle but determined expression he was learning to recognize, "tell me about your people. What are the Kreks like when they're not crashed in alien forests?" The next hour was one of the most difficult in Thacklor's military career. Explaining Krek civilization to someone like Sarah required him to confront aspects of his culture that he had never really examined before. How did you describe a society built on conquest and dominance to someone whose default response to meeting strangers was to offer medical aid? He started with the basics. The Krek's empire controlled 17 star systems, with a total population of nearly 50 billion across multiple worlds. They were a military hierarchy where status was determined by combat prowess and successful leadership in battle. Their expansion across the galaxy had been driven by a philosophy of conquest that viewed superior strength as both right and responsibility. "So you're the good guys in your own story," Sarah observed when he paused. "You see yourselves as bringing order and strength to a chaotic galaxy." Thacklor had never heard it phrased quite that way, but he supposed it was accurate. "Yes, we believe that the strong have an obligation to rule over the weak. It prevents unnecessary suffering and ensures efficient resource allocation. And the weak just accept this arrangement?" The question was more complex than Sarah probably realized. "Some do. Others resist, but resistance is usually brief." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, continuing to eat while she processed this information. Her calmness in the face of learning that his people were essentially galactic conquerors was remarkable and somewhat unsettling. "What happens to civilizations that resist?" she asked. Thacklor found himself reluctant to answer, but her steady gaze and the kindness she had shown him made deception feel impossible. "Populations that cannot be integrated are usually relocated to designated worlds where they can live without interfering with Krek's operations." Relocated. That's a nice way of saying enslaved. It wasn't really a question, and Thacklor didn't try to deny it. Among his own people, slave labor was considered an efficient solution to the problem of dealing with conquered populations. The Kreks did not see it as cruelty, merely practicality. And populations that actively resist relocation? This time, Thacklor couldn't answer immediately. The fate of civilizations that fought too hard against Krek's conquest was something that warrior training covered in tactical terms. But sitting here in Sarah's peaceful home, eating food she had prepared for his healing, the clinical language of military objectives felt inadequate. "They are eliminated," he said finally. Sarah set down her fork and looked at him for a long moment. Thacklor braced himself for fear, anger, or rejection. Instead, what he saw in her eyes was something that might have been sadness. "How many?" she asked softly. "How many what? How many civilizations have been eliminated?" Thacklor had never thought of it as a number before. Resistance was simply a problem to be solved, and elimination was one of several available solutions. But, forced to think of it in numerical terms, he realized the scope was staggering. "I don't know exactly. Perhaps dozens. Dozens of entire civilizations." The way she said it made the reality of what he was describing hit him with unexpected force. Dozens of worlds, billions or possibly trillions of individual beings. Entire cultures, histories, ways of understanding the universe, simply erased because they had refused to submit to Krek's authority. "It is the nature of expansion," he said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. "No," Sarah said quietly but firmly. "It's a choice. Expansion doesn't require elimination. It just requires a different approach." "What other approach is there?" "The weak cannot stand against the strong. The strong can choose to protect the weak instead of conquering them." The concept was so alien to Krek's thinking that Thacklor initially had trouble even understanding what she meant. Protecting the weak was something you did for your own offspring or valuable allies, not for strangers who had nothing to offer in return. Why would the strong choose to do that, he asked. Sarah smiled at him, and there was something in that expression that reminded him of the moment she had first approached his crash site without fear. Because it makes the strong stronger, she said. Look around you, Thacklor. Everything you see here exists because I chose to work with the natural systems instead of trying to dominate them. The forest, the gardens, the house, even the food we're eating. All of it is more productive and more beautiful than anything I could have created through force. She gestured toward the window where Chester, the large predator she had befriended, was visible at the edge of the clearing. Chester could easily kill me if he chose to. He's bigger, stronger, and better armed than I am. But instead, he helps protect this place because he knows I'll take care of him when he's hurt or sick. The relationship makes both of us safer and happier. But Chester is just one animal. Governing an interstellar empire requires dealing with countless different species with conflicting interests. Does it? Sarah asked. Or does it just require understanding what all those species actually need and finding ways to provide it that benefit everyone? The idea was intriguing but seemed impossibly naive. There are not enough resources in the galaxy to give every species everything they want. Want and need are different things, Sarah pointed out. Most species want the same basic things: security, enough food and shelter, the ability to raise their children in peace, and the freedom to pursue their own cultural interests. Those aren't zero-sum resources. One species having those things doesn't prevent another species from having them too. Thacklor found himself thinking about the Krex Empire from this perspective, and the results were uncomfortable. How much of Krex expansion was actually driven by necessity, and how much was simply the result of never questioning whether conquest was the only available option? You make it sound simple, he said. Not simple, Sarah corrected. Just possible. It requires a lot more patience and creativity than conquest, but the results tend to be more stable and satisfying for everyone involved. She stood up and began clearing the dishes, moving with her characteristic efficiency. Would you like to see some examples? Before Thacklor could ask what she meant, Sarah had activated some kind of communication device that he hadn't noticed before. It was seamlessly integrated into the house's organic technology, appearing to be in natural growth until she touched it, and it began to glow with soft bioluminescence. Maria? It's Sarah. Do you have a few minutes to chat with a visitor? She paused, listening to something he couldn't hear. Yes, he's from Off-World. Very Off-World. I think you'd find him interesting. The device projected what appeared to be a three-dimensional image in the air above it. The figure that appeared was clearly human, but with some notable differences from Sarah. Her skin had a slightly blue tint, and there were small gill slits visible on her neck. When she smiled, Thacklor could see that her teeth were arranged differently than Sarah's, adapted for a different kind of diet. Hello, the woman said, looking directly at Thacklor with eyes that held intelligence and curiosity, but no fear. I'm Maria Santos Delacroix. Sarah tells me you're visiting from another star system. I am Thacklor of the Krex, he replied, still trying to process what he was seeing. You are human, but adapted for aquatic living. Maria finished with apparent amusement. My ancestors chose to modify themselves when they colonized the ocean cities about 200 years ago. We found it easier to change ourselves to fit the environment than to try to change the environment to fit us. 200 years ago, genetic modification sophisticated enough to allow humans to live underwater. Thacklor was rapidly revising his estimates of human technological capabilities. Maria runs one of the larger agricultural cooperatives, Sarah explained. Her people specialize in ocean farming and marine ecosystem management. We feed about 50,000 people across 6 different cities, Maria said conversationally. All sustainable production, of course. We learned early on that you can't take more from the ocean than it can replace without eventually destroying the whole system. Your cities are underwater? Thacklor asked. Most of them, yes. Though we have surface installations too. Would you like to see? The projection shifted to show what appeared to be a vast underwater complex. Graceful towers and domes were integrated into natural coral reefs, with gardens of sea plants and schools of fish moving freely through the structures. It was clearly the work of an advanced civilization, but one that had chosen to work in harmony with the natural environment rather than replacing it. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Maria said. "It took us about 50 years to develop the biotechnology to build like this, but now our cities actually improve the ocean ecosystem around them. We produce more food per square kilometer than the old land-based systems ever did, and we do it without depleting any natural resources." The projection changed again, showing what appeared to be a manufacturing facility where humans and modified humans worked alongside various mechanical systems. But instead of the harsh industrial environments Thacklor was familiar with from Krex factories, this facility looked more like a garden. Plants were integrated into the production process, apparently serving both decorative and functional purposes. "This is where we develop new biotechnologies," Maria explained. "Most of our tools and equipment are grown rather than manufactured in the traditional sense. It's more efficient and produces much less waste. Grown tools and equipment." Thacklor was beginning to understand that human technology had developed along completely different lines than anything in the Krex databases. Where Krex engineering focused on imposing mechanical solutions through superior materials and energy, humans appear to have focused on understanding and cooperating with biological systems. "How many cities like this exist?" he asked. "On this world?" "About 300 ocean cities, maybe 800 land-based settlements, and probably 50 or so orbital installations," Maria said casually. "Though the numbers change as communities split or merge based on their interests and needs." Orbital instalations. This supposedly primitive death world had orbital installations. Thacklor felt his understanding of the strategic situation shifting in ways that were both fascinating and alarming. "I should let you two get back to your conversation," Maria said. "But, Thacklor, if your people are interested in learning about alternative approaches to civilization, we'd be happy to share our experiences. We've had good relationships with several off-world species over the years." The image faded, leaving Thacklor staring at the space where it had been. Several off-world species. This world was already in contact with alien civilizations, and apparently managing those relationships successfully. "How many?" he asked. "How many what?" Sarah replied, though her expression suggested she knew exactly what he was asking. "How many off-world species have you had contact with?" Sarah settled back down across from him with an expression that was both amused and slightly apologetic. "About 47 different species have established formal diplomatic relationships with Earth governments," she said, "though we've had informal contact with maybe twice that many. We tend to be pretty welcoming to visitors, especially ones who are curious about how we do things here." 47 species. Formal diplomatic relationships. Earth governments, plural. Everything Thacklor thought he knew about this world was crumbling around him. "Why didn't this appear in any of our intelligence reports?" he asked. "Well," Sarah said thoughtfully, "most species who visit us are looking for the same thing your people probably were. Signs of advanced technology, military installations, resource extraction capabilities, that sort of thing. What they find is a bunch of agricultural communities and people who seem to spend most of their time gardening. But the orbital installations are mostly agricultural too. We grow a lot of our food in space because the conditions can be more precisely controlled. From the outside, they probably look like small research stations or maybe mining operations." Thacklor was beginning to understand. Human civilization had developed in ways that were completely outside the normal parameters that Galactic Intelligence Services looked for. Instead of the obvious signs of military and industrial power that most species displayed, humans had created a civilization that was simultaneously more advanced and more subtle than anything in the standard databases. "Sarah," he said slowly, "what exactly is Earth's position in galactic politics? Officially, we're a non-aligned agricultural world with no significant military capabilities and limited interest in interstellar affairs. Sarah's smile was definitely amused now. Unofficially, with a place that other species come to when they have problems they can't solve through conventional means. What kind of problems? Oh, ecological disasters, resource depletion, social conflicts, technological challenges that require biological solutions. Last year, we helped the Zentorians deal with a plague that was killing their food crops, and we've been working with the Hort Collective to develop sustainable mining techniques that don't destroy planetary ecosystems. The Zentorians and the Hort Collective both were major galactic powers, though they rarely cooperated with each other. If Earth was successfully mediating between them and providing solutions to their resource problems, then human influence in galactic affairs was far greater than anyone realized. And your own military capabilities? Thacklor asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would be as unexpected as everything else about this world. We don't really think in terms of military capabilities, Sarah said, but we do take security seriously. Our defensive systems are, let's say, they're very difficult to detect and very effective against conventional approaches. Biological defenses, among other things. It turns out that if you really understand living systems, there are a lot of ways to discourage aggression that don't require traditional weapons. Thacklor thought about the managed forest around Sarah's home, the way local wildlife seemed to cooperate with her activities, the biotechnology he had seen in Maria's cities. If humans had developed the ability to integrate their defensive systems with planetary ecosystems, then any invasion force would face opposition from the entire biosphere. How effective would such defenses be against Krek's forces? He asked. Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. That would depend entirely on what Krek's forces were trying to accomplish, she said. If they came here looking for a fight, they would find one, and it wouldn't go the way they expect. But if they came here looking for solutions to problems or opportunities for cooperation, they would find those instead. And if they came here looking for conquest, Sarah's expression became more serious, though still not fearful. Then we would have to protect ourselves and everyone who depends on us for support, including, if I'm understanding your situation correctly, you. The realization hit Thacklor like a physical blow. In accepting Sarah's help, in allowing her to treat his injuries and bring him into her home, he had not just received aid from a member of another species. He had become part of a network of relationships that spanned multiple worlds and dozens of alien civilizations. If the Krek's fleet came here expecting to find a primitive world ripe for conquest, they would instead find themselves confronting a civilization that was both more powerful and more deeply connected than anything in their experience. And their missing scout, whose disappearance had probably prompted the search mission in the first place, would be found as a guest in the home of these supposedly primitive beings. It would be interpreted as either treason or catastrophic failure of judgment. Either way, it would likely mean his death. Sarah, he said quietly, when my people arrive, my presence here will be seen as a betrayal of everything they believe about strength and proper conduct. She nodded gravely. I understand. The question is, what do you believe about strength and proper conduct? It was the question Thacklor had been avoiding since the moment she had first approached his crash site without fear. Everything about his experience with Sarah and her world suggested that the Krek's understanding of strength and civilization was not just wrong, but catastrophically inadequate. But admitting that would mean questioning everything he had built his life around. Outside the window, the managed forest swayed in the evening breeze, and Chester the Predator dozed peacefully in a patch of sunlight. The view was beautiful and peaceful and utterly unlike anything in Thacklor's previous experience. For the first time in his military career, he found himself wondering what it would be like to defend something instead of conquering it. The Krek's fleet arrived 3 days later, announcing their presence with all the subtlety that Thacklor had expected. His enhanced senses detected the electromagnetic signatures of military-grade sensors sweeping the planet's surface, while his former comrades searched for signs of their missing scout. Sarah noticed the arrival even before Thacklor did. Your friends are here, she said, looking up from the communication device where she had been coordinating with other settlements. 12 ships in high orbit, running what appear to be standard reconnaissance patterns. 12 ships. Thacklor closed his eyes and tried to calculate the implications. That was far more than a simple search and rescue mission would require. It was a small invasion force, probably under orders to investigate the disappearance of a scout ship and evaluate the world for potential conquest operations. "They'll find my crash site soon," he said. "The wreckage is too distinctive to hide, and their sensors are designed for exactly this kind of search." "I know," Sarah replied calmly. "We've been tracking them since they entered the system. They're being very thorough. We've been tracking them." Thacklor was no longer surprised by revelations about human capabilities, but the casual way Sarah mentioned planetary sensor networks that could monitor space traffic was still remarkable. "What will you do when they find the wreckage?" he asked. "What would you like us to do?" The question caught him off guard. In his experience, conquer populations didn't get to choose how they responded to Krek's forces. They could submit or resist, but either way, the outcome was determined by Krek's military superiority. "I don't understand." Sarah set down her communication device and turned to face him fully. Over the past 3 days, as his injuries healed with remarkable speed thanks to her medical care, they had spent many hours discussing their respective civilizations. The conversations had been educational and troubling in equal measure, forcing Thacklor to confront assumptions about strength and civilization that he had never questioned before. "Your people are here looking for you," she said. "They're probably also evaluating whether this world represents a threat or an opportunity for their empire. How they interpret what they find depends largely on how we present the situation." "How you present the situation?" "Well, we could hide you and pretend we never found your crash site. Your people might eventually conclude that you died on impact, and they might leave us alone for a while. But that doesn't solve the underlying problem." "What underlying problem?" Sarah gestured toward the window, where the managed forest stretched toward the horizon. "The problem of two civilizations with completely different ideas about strength and cooperation trying to coexist in the same galaxy. Eventually, that's going to come to a head, and it's better to deal with it when we can choose the circumstances." Thacklor stared at her. "You want to make contact with them deliberately?" "I want to find a solution that works for everyone, including you." The concern for his welfare in this situation was both touching and frustrating. "Sarah, you don't understand what will happen to me when they find me here. Accepting aid from a non-Krex is considered a sign of weakness. Becoming personally involved with members of species that should be conquered is seen as a betrayal of warrior honor." "And what do you see it as?" Another of her impossible questions. Thacklor had been wrestling with this issue for 3 days, and he still didn't have an answer that satisfied him. What had happened between him and Sarah didn't fit into any category that Krek's culture recognized. She had saved his life when she could have simply ignored his presence. She had treated his injuries with skills that exceeded anything in Krek's medical training. She had shared her home, her food, and her knowledge with him without asking for anything in return. She had shown him possibilities for civilization that he had never imagined. In Krek's terms, accepting all of this should have been shameful. But Thacklor found that he felt no shame, only gratitude, and a growing conviction that his people's understanding of strength and honor was fundamentally flawed. "I see it as the beginning of wisdom," he said finally. Sarah smiled at him with that warm expression that had become so familiar over the past few days. "Then, let's see if we can help your people begin to develop some wisdom too." Before Thacklor could ask what she meant by that, the communication device activated again. This time, the voice that emerged spoke in formal Krek's military protocols. "Attention, inhabitants of the third planet. This is War Commander Drakthal of the Krek's Imperial Fleet. We are conducting a search operation for a missing scout vessel. Any information regarding alien technology or personnel will be rewarded. Failure to cooperate will be considered hostile action." The translation into human language was provided by what Thacklor realized must be a sophisticated universal translation system, far more advanced than his own combat-grade equipment. But More significant was Sarah's reaction to the ultimatum. Instead of fear or anger, she simply looked thoughtful. War Commander Drakthal, she repeated, apparently testing the pronunciation. Do you know him? He is my immediate superior, Thaklor said, an experienced officer with a record of successful conquest operations. He will not be easily convinced to pursue diplomatic solutions. Well, Sarah said, standing up and moving toward what he had learned was her personal workspace. Then, we'll have to be creative. She activated a more complex version of the communication system she had used to contact Maria, and immediately Thaklor could hear multiple voices speaking in various human languages. She was apparently coordinating with settlements across the planet. Yes, they're here, she was saying to someone. 12 ships, standard intimidation formation. We need to implement the polite reception protocol. Polite reception protocol? Thaklor was learning that humans had contingency plans for situations that most species never even considered. James, can you have the orbital platforms adjust their configuration to look harmless mode? Sarah continued. And, Maria, please make sure the ocean cities are in cultural exchange display rather than anything that might be interpreted as military positioning. She paused to listen to responses, then continued. Good. Elena, I need you to prepare a full diplomatic package for upload. Include the agricultural cooperation agreements, the ecological restoration project summaries, and the complete technical exchange documentation from our previous off-world contacts. Thaklor was beginning to understand that Earth's response to the Krex fleet was based on extensive experience with first contact situations. What is the polite reception protocol? He asked when Sarah finished her immediate coordination tasks. A standard procedure we developed for dealing with species who arrive with aggressive intentions, but might be persuaded to consider alternatives, she explained. The basic idea is to demonstrate our capabilities and peaceful intentions simultaneously, while giving them opportunities to save face if they choose to pursue cooperation instead of conquest. And if they refuse those opportunities? Sarah's expression became more serious. Then, we implement the protective measures protocol instead. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. An hour later, Thaklor watched through Sarah's communication system as the first direct contact between humans and the Krex fleet took place. The humans had chosen a representative who immediately challenged every assumption about primitive civilizations. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared to be middle-aged by human standards, with silver hair and an air of calm authority that reminded Thaklor of the senior diplomatic officers in the Krex hierarchy. She wore simple clothing that managed to be both practical and elegant, and she spoke with the kind of confidence that came from extensive experience in complex negotiations. Greetings, War Commander Drakthal, she said, her image projected directly to the Krex flagship. I am Elena Vasquez, speaking on behalf of Earth's Coordinated Response Council. We understand that you're searching for one of your people. War Commander Drakthal appeared in the return transmission, and Thaklor felt a complicated mix of familiarity and apprehension at seeing his former commander. Drakthal was impressive even by Krex standards, nearly 9 feet tall and heavily armored, with battle scars that spoke of decades of successful military operations. His 4 arms ended in claws that could tear through most materials, and his eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that had made him one of the most feared officers in the Krex fleet. You will address me as War Commander, Drakthal replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. I am not here for conversation. You will provide information about our missing scout, where you will face the consequences of your refusal. Elena nodded politely, apparently unintimidated by the display of aggressive authority. Of course, War Commander. We're happy to help with your search. In fact, we've located your missing scout and have been providing medical assistance. The statement clearly caught Drakthal off guard. In his experience, primitive species either denied knowledge of Krex forces or tried to use capture personnel as bargaining chips. The idea that they would voluntarily provide medical aid was outside his tactical calculations. You have captured one of my warriors? We've rescued him, Elena corrected gently, His ship crashed in a forest area, and he sustained significant injuries. One of our medical specialists has been treating his wounds. He's recovering well. Thaklor could see Drakthel processing this information and reaching conclusions that were probably completely wrong. In Krek's military thinking, any species capable of providing effective medical aid to alien biology was probably more advanced than initial assessments had indicated. The fact that they were being open about it suggested either remarkable confidence or elaborate deception. "You will return our warrior immediately," Drakthel commanded. "Absolutely," Elena agreed. "We would never keep anyone against their will. When would you like to arrange the transfer?" Again, Drakthel seemed taken aback by the immediate cooperation. Thaklor realized that Elena was systematically eliminating the standard justifications that Krek's commanders used to escalate encounters into conquest situations. "You will transport him to coordinates that we will provide," Drakthel said. "Any attempt at deception or ambush will result in the complete destruction of your settlement." "I understand your concern for security," Elena replied. "However, I should mention that your scout is currently recovering in a location that's about 40 kilometers from the near settlement. The area is quite beautiful, actually. If you'd like, we could arrange for you to meet him there, and you could see some of our conservation work at the same time." Conservation work. Elena was offering Drakthel a cultural exchange opportunity disguised as a prisoner transfer. It was either brilliant diplomacy or dangerous naivety, and Thaklor wasn't sure which. "I do not require a tour of your primitive installations," Drakthel replied. "Send us the coordinates. We will retrieve our warrior and evaluate whether your world has anything else of value to the Krex Empire." "Of course," Elena said, "though I should mention that we have experience working with off-world species on various projects. If your empire has any interest in agricultural technology, ecological restoration, or sustainable resource development, we'd be happy to share our research." The offer hung in the air for a moment, while Drakthel clearly struggled with how to categorize what he was hearing. Primitive species weren't supposed to have anything to offer advanced civilizations. They certainly weren't supposed to casually mention experience with other off-world species. "What other species have you had contact with?" he asked finally. Elena provided a brief overview of Earth's diplomatic relationships, mentioning several names that Thaklor knew were major galactic powers. The implication was clear. Earth was already integrated into galactic civilization, with formal relationships that any aggressive action would need to account for. "You claim to have relationships with the Zentorians and the Horthack Collective?" "Among others, yes. We've been particularly helpful in mediating some of their resource disputes. It turns out that many interspecies conflicts can be resolved when you find ways for everyone to get what they actually need. Mediation between major galactic powers." Thaklor could see Drakthel rapidly recalculating the strategic situation. If Earth really had the kind of diplomatic connections Elena was describing, then a conquest operation could trigger conflicts with multiple advanced civilizations simultaneously. "I will investigate these claims," Drakthel said. "In the meantime, you will prepare our warrior for immediate retrieval." "Of course. However, I should mention that he may need a day or two more to complete his healing before he's ready for space travel. The crash was quite severe, and while our treatment has been effective, we want to make sure he's fully recovered before exposing him to the stresses of interstellar flight." It was a reasonable medical concern, but Thaklor realized it also served another purpose. The delay would give both sides time to investigate each other's claims and consider their options before any irreversible actions were taken. One day, Drakthel said, "Then we retrieve our warrior and determine what action to take regarding your world." The transmission ended, leaving Elena alone in the projection. She turned to look directly at Thaklor through Sarah's communication system. "Well," she said with a slight smile, "that went about as expected. Now we have 24 hours to figure out how to convince your war commander that cooperation is more profitable than conquest." "It won't be easy," Thaklor warned. Drakthel has built his career on successful military operations. He sees negotiation as a sign of weakness. "Then we'll have to show him a different kind of strength," Elena replied. the kind that builds rather than destroys. After Elena's image faded, Sarah sat down beside Thacklor with her expression that mixed determination and concern. "So," she said, "are you ready to help us save both our worlds?" Thacklor looked out at the managed forest where he had spent the most peaceful days of his adult life, thought about the Krek's fleet overhead preparing for what they assumed would be a simple conquest operation, and made the most important decision of his military career. "Yes," he said, "I am." The meeting took place in Sarah's clearing, with the managed forest providing a backdrop that perfectly illustrated everything the humans wanted to communicate. Thacklor stood beside Sarah as the Krek's shuttle descended, its military design stark and aggressive against the organic beauty of the landscape. War Commander Drakthul emerged from the shuttle with an honor guard of 4 warriors, all of them armed and armored for combat. They moved with the disciplined precision that Thacklor remembered from countless military operations, but for the first time he found himself seeing that precision from an outside perspective. They looked like what they were, predators prepared for violence. In contrast, Sarah stood calmly beside him, wearing simple clothing and carrying no visible weapons. Elena was there as well, along with 3 other humans who had been introduced as specialists in different aspects of Earth's diplomatic protocols. None of them showed any sign of fear or aggression, but Thacklor had learned enough about human capabilities to know that their peaceful appearance didn't necessarily indicate vulnerability. "War Commander," Thacklor said, stepping forward and offering the formal salute he had learned as a young warrior. Drakthul examined him with the analytical gaze that missed nothing. Thacklor knew his commander was noting the excellent condition of his healing, the casual way he stood near the humans, and the fact that he appeared to be unarmed and unrestrained.